So for those of you that know, last year saw the 50th anniversary of the release of Martin Scorsese's, for many Martin Scorsese's first notable key work, Mean Streets. And this month, 2024 that we're now in, of course, Second Sight released in the UK this limited edition set of the film, probably to kind of celebrate its 50th anniversary. There's a few special features on here, but obviously what's most notable is the big deal is it's a 4K restoration of the film. And of course we have in here the limited edition is a 178 page, I think, hardback book with loads of essays in, most of which I've read, and a lot of them, all of them actually are really informative and give decent critical analysis of the film. So that's well worth checking out if you are interested in getting this set. It's about 45 quid, I think, if there's still any copies of it left. And I rewatched it earlier, for the first time in a few years, actually, from beginning to end. And it got me thinking, and that's why I wanted to jump on here and make a video about this and discuss with you guys. It got me thinking with the fact that I think Mean Streets, not only do I mean, for me personally, not only do I think it's I still think it's one of Scorsese's top 5 or 6 films that he's actually made to date, actually. And of course, he's been making films now for well over 50 years. Last year, of course, saw the release of Killers of the Flower Moon to huge critical reception. I think it's actually, as I filmed this, it's not long received 10 or 11 Oscar nominations, so it might do very, very well at the Oscars even. But we shall see. Not that I take much stock in the Oscars anyway, but it's nice to see a film that at least is a bit kind of austere and epic, and a film of that nature, I think, getting some kind of mainstream critical recognition and success. But for me, as much as I liked Killers of the Flower Moon, like I said, that's kind of Scorsese in his kind of austere late career phase. For many of us, we still go right back to 1973 to rewatch, for us, one of our favourite films of his, which is Mean Streets. A film which clocks in at under 2 hours, which is a rarity for Scorsese. And like I said, the main thing I wanted to jump on here and talk about is when rewatching it in particular, I kept thinking to myself, this is a kind of movie that just doesn't get made anymore. And for that reason, I also think it's the kind of movie that would struggle to connect with modern audiences. Indeed, actually, a lot of modern audiences now, even though Scorsese has this kind of, I think it's a bit of a misnomer and a cliched suggestion even to suggest that Scorsese only directs mob movies or crime movies. He's made well over 40 feature films. He's made more music documentaries than he has actually mob movies, for example. But even with that reputation, I think Mean Streets is not one of the first features that many people talk about and think of when they think of Martin Scorsese's filmography. And I think that's actually a bit of a shame. I don't know if it's because it has the reputation of as being like the first notable film, therefore we have this perception in our minds that the early works of a director, however great they might be, they go on to mature and make better works, which I just think is simply rubbish. That's the case for some directors, but it's not a given. Every director's career is different. And in the case of Scorsese, I personally think that most of his key or great works actually occurred earlier on in his career. And for me, Mean Streets is a great movie. And I want to kind of talk about why I think that's the case now. And it fits with the topic of the discussion that I really want to focus on. Like I say, is I just don't think Mean Streets it's not the kind of movie that would be made anymore. And I was thinking this about halfway through the film when I realised that with Mean Streets, you're introduced to a lot of the characters straight away, of which there are 3 or 4, right? You've got, of course, Charlie, who's played by Harvey Keitel, who's the lead in the film, which is interesting in of itself because it's, I think, based off the evidence of this film, you can see why Scorsese creatively, in terms of creative direction, he ended up going with De Niro as his leading man, and they had that, of course, that wonderful partnership for the next 10 years or so, where they made a series of great movies together. You have De Niro, yeah, if I mentioned Robert De Niro playing Johnny Boy, who's the kind of the troublesome friend to Charlie. Charlie, of course, is like this kind of low-level mobster who's kind of conflicted between does he kind of want to commit to that lifestyle? Does he want to actually own a restaurant? he's got this confliction between that and helping his friends who are getting Johnny Boy, who's getting further and further into debt, and dating Johnny Boy's cousin Teresa, who has, I don't know if she kind of has this reputation of, because through a via association of with Johnny Boy, that she's trouble as well. She also suffers from epilepsy, which, you know, Charlie's boss says she's sick in the head because she has epilepsy. Those kind of those old people viewpoints for you, you know, how they've aged. Then again, not everything in Mean Streets itself has aged terribly well. There's actually one scene in the film with the two, well, two or at least one homosexual character in the car that I think comes across now quite comic reliefy and crude. That I don't think that's the most jarring scene in the picture for me now, but it also it still works in a sense because it's also showing off the rampant homophobia that exists or existed at the time, at least in that local community. I don't want to say if it's, you know, specific to Italian Americans, of course, but that nonetheless existed in 1970s New York, say, or America, and still does exist, let's be honest. But I think the film, what's so fascinating about Mean Streets, so the reason why I think modern audiences would struggle to connect to it, first off, it's depicting a world that no longer exists, 1970s New York, which there's a lot of great movies that depict this. I actually recently watched the other day for the first time, taking a Pelham 123, which is I would put down now as another kind of great 1970s New York movie. That is probably one that people don't first think of. But so it depicts a world that's kind of long gone, and a lot of Mean Streets is about building up this verisimilitude of this milieu of Little Italy, of lower level crime, of a kind of gritty world, but also a kind of communal one where everyone knows everyone, and even if there's criminal goings on, everyone kind of respects and kind of looks out for everyone in some sense. But like I say, you have Charlie, you have Johnny Boy, and then you have Michael, who's the kind of mobster, who's a low-level mobster himself, who Johnny Boy's indebted to. And you also have Tony, who runs this bar in Little Italy, this kind of bar restaurant, which all these characters kind of congregate to. And a lot of the film takes place in this bar. Saying it's a great 1970s New York movie, actually, is testament to the fact that a lot of it was shot in LA, actually. I think the exteriors and some of the... there's a couple of other key scenes that were shot in New York, but a lot of it was actually shot in LA, which is really, really interesting to think, because you wouldn't think that when watching the film at all. And I think, but like I say, I was about halfway through watching this film, and I just thought to myself, you know, this film wouldn't be made today particularly in the style in which it's made. And this is what makes Mean Streets for me a great movie, is it has such a formal confidence to it, in the sense that, like I say, I was halfway through the film, so about an hour into the film, and you realise there's not much plot that's happened. And that's because Mean Streets for me, it's a kind of jazzy, improvisational film where its major influences are both the French New Wave, particularly the films of Godard. You could argue actually Mean Streets is kind of Scorsese's Breathless, which of course is the first feature film made by Jean-Luc Godard, the famous French New Wave director, former critic turned director in 1960, 59. And his other major influences, of course, John Cassavetes, the American independent filmmaker, particularly his film Shadows, I think, from 1959 also. Those two films, the legacy of them is all over Mean Streets, I think. And what Scorsese does is he takes this real, like I say, jazzy, improvisational style in which he allows scenes to play out with actors. Not even that he allows them to play out, they're actually constructed around the improvisations. So what you get is a film that's very, very free from plot, particularly in the first hour. What you do get is you get a sense of who each character is and their relations to the other characters and the moral quandaries that are at play. And actually one of the essays in the book touches on this. a lot of the pleasure that's to be had in revisiting this film, I think, is in just viewing these relationships between these characters and the fun and the joy that's had, the camaraderie between friends. And I think that's certainly the case. I think you could argue that this is actually like an antecedent to what we would now label a hangout movie. I think Mean Streets is a great hangout movie because a lot of the movie is you're just spending time with characters, watching scenes play out. Like I say, that aren't necessarily connected to one another, but they build up a kind of collage of like I say, relationships and interrelationships, as well as a kind of milieu of the world that these characters inhabit. And for me, that's the most vivid thing about the film. The techniques that Scorsese employs to depict all of this are, I think, still amazing, actually. The tracking shot which first introduces Johnny Boy in the bar, in Tony's bar, where it's bathed in red, and Jumping Jack Flash is playing by Rolling Stones. It looks like it was done with a Steadicam, but Steadicam wasn't utilised until 1975. But it's an incredibly, and it's like time slows down. This kind of slow motion introduction of this character. It's a very iconic entrance, and of course with the needle drop of Jumping Jack Flash, things like that nowadays are kind of taken for granted. The use of a kind of rock soundtrack or particular songs that are used to introduce a notable character, that wasn't really done back in 1973. So it's a bit more commonplace now, and it's kind of cliched now, really. But Scorsese is the one who really kind of pioneered that usage, particularly the widespread usage of it, because there's a lot of great tracks in this film, and music plays a very, very key part in this film, in which when Scorsese, he actually talks about this in an interview, I think it's in the book Scorsese on Scorsese, where when he places a song in the film, he wants the action suspended and us to actually pay more attention to the song. And so what the images do is they accompany the song, but action in time becomes kind of, like I said, there's a suspension of those things, which I think has always been the case with Scorsese a lot of the times. I mean, don't get me wrong, he also uses it to great effect with kind of like in montage as well. But particularly in Mean Streets, he uses it to great effect with just, I say, suspending time with these slow motion shots. I think another great example of his inventiveness and his playfulness, which I think Scorsese has lost over the years. Like I say, he's a lot more into making austere films now. And you can kind of like pinpoint what his style is. I'm not saying he's become a parody of himself, but for me, Scorsese was a lot more kind of unpredictable and radical and playful in his earlier works. There's a great moment where Harvey Keitel's Charlie is drunk as he's waiting for Johnny Boy to turn up so he can pay the debts to Michael. And the way they show the subjective experience of Charlie being drunk is they attach a board here and place the camera onto the board so that whenever Charlie moves, whether it's through space or around in the frame, we're moving in sync with that, which makes us feel drunk, essentially. And he kind of collapses to one point and the camera follows him down. Something which actually he uses again in Raging Bull, when the fighter gets knocked out. The fighter gets knocked out and the camera follows him down as if we're being kind of knocked out with him. It's a phenomenal effect, and it goes on. It's an indication of the kind of techniques that he uses to get us inside the head so well, trapped inside the mind of Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver. Scorsese is a great expressionist filmmaker who uses the camera as a means to put us in the subjective mind and realm of his protagonists. And he, like I say, he very, very inventively and vividly does this. There's, of course, the great cut early on in the film where Harvey Keitel's Charlie wakes up, goes to the mirror, comes back into bed, and then it cuts to the incoming of the beat of the Ronettes' "Be My Baby" as his head hits the pillow. It's an iconic needle track, but a great marriage of sound and image, I think. And there's also, and I think this scene is heavily inspired by Breathless, which is the kind of post-coital scene between Teresa and Charlie in the bedroom, which is like one of the few kind of like daytime bright scenes in the film, which is, I think, to kind of portray this kind of like safe place, space, and innocence, that the playfulness that the two characters have with one another. Because Charlie is somewhat childlike still in this film. It's important to remember that these guys are meant to be young guys, almost still finding their feet. They live with their parents still, and they're kind of just petty criminals, but also just a group of friends, really. Still trying to figure out what they want from life, essentially. Anyway, they're in the bed together, and she gets out, and there's a moment where she sits back down on the bed, and he kind of pulls a gun pose, and there's almost a sound of a gunshot of him mimicking firing a weapon. We hear a sound of a gunshot on a quick edit to something else later on the actions, like a jump cut to something else, but we're still in the room. That's very, very Godardian, and it's just, he does something similar in Taxi Driver, actually, where with Travis Bickle, where he's kind of reciting his speech and he's talking to us, and the action replays because Bickle messes up his own monologue. It's, again, this very, very breaking the rules of cinema, what were the rules of cinema at the time, and actually just using film form to kind of, like I say, express the characters' mindsets and subjective experiences. And there's just so many of those moments in the film, the playfulness, that I just always make me want to revisit the film. There's a part late on in the film, actually, with where we return to, because there's voiceover narration in the film, which again is actually played by, voiceover narration is done by both Cattell and Scorsese. And the reason why Scorsese kind of puts himself in the film as the kind of the voiceover narrator for Charlie at times is because of the kind of the semi-autobiographical elements of Mean Streets, in which Scorsese was thinking through his own dilemma of where he wants to go in life and where religion's placed in his life, how that dictates his kind of worldview and his choices, as well as the guilt that he feels for things and how to redeem and work through that guilt. But there's a moment late on in the film where Charlie kind of goes back to doing a monologue where he's saying about how he's trying and what a night it's been or something. But then we cut halfway through the monologue to see that he's actually saying it to himself in the car. But in the car is Teresa and Johnny Boy, and they kind of look at him and laugh and go, "Are you talking to yourself now?" So it turns, 1 minute it goes from voiceover monologue to he's actually saying it in a scene with characters present, and they mock him for it as if he's talking to himself. Again, very, very playful moments. And it's all these, to me, that create this kind of this real sense of Scorsese. What would actually, Mark Cousins refers to this in his book, The Story of Film, that Scorsese's opening up film form. He's taking the kind of the playful innovations and the experimental improvisational work of Cassavetes with the playfulness and the inventiveness of the new wave, synthesizing the two and creating and constituting something new out of it. And that's, for me, why I think Mean Streets is still such an important and vital film that shouldn't be forgotten. And I think it's still, like I say, it's one of his greatest films. It introduced us, of course, a lot of us to De Niro, to Robert De Niro, who is fantastic in this film, as is Harvey Keitel. The real kind of the dramatic tension and crux of the film really is Charlie's misplaced faith in his friend, but also that he's trying to do good and stand by his friend, but at the same time that comes between him and his professional and personal commitments elsewhere, namely, like I said, with Teresa, the mafia, and him wanting to open his own restaurant is something he wants to do in terms of going straight, as it were. So that tension plays out throughout the film, but it doesn't really become overtly the concern of the film until halfway through. Like I say, a lot of the film is just hanging out with these characters that are telling stories, having fun with one another, getting into a lot of trouble. One obviously key scene is the Mook scene, the pool hall fight, which again that's done in kind of long handheld takes in which you see the kind of the messiness of real life fights. When there's just brawls with people, it's just messy. It's not meant to be overtly choreographed as it is so often particularly in modern cinema, where it feels like it's over choreographed. Here, it's just like there's just a messiness to it, and you cut between different factions of people fighting. Johnny Boy getting on the pool table and swinging the pool cue and being taken down. It's all about creating a kind of sense of energy, and a kind of comedy from silly and stupid situations that these people get themselves into. You know, the whole point of the pool hall scene really is to show how Johnny Boy's kind of volatility, unpredictability, but also is kind of just, he doesn't care about social politeness or rules or anything like that, insults the person that owes money, and which he should see himself in that person, which is interesting because he calls that person a scumbag. So he's really calling himself a scumbag. There's a lot of kind of self-hatred there, I think, from Johnny Boy's character, of his own weaknesses and predicaments. He calls the guy a scumbag, and then it results in them brawling, and then they calm down because the police come in. They calm down, they have a drink again, he gives them money, and then they fight again, and they leave. And it's just to show the kind of futility and stupidity of, in real life, I suppose, why a lot of these kind of things happen between people. So it feels kind of very like naturalistic at the same time as being, of course, formally playful and funny. And like I said, that's the thing to take away from Mean Streets, I think, is the vitality of the film. I think the vibrancy of the film, as well as, of course, the formal achievements of the film. Remember, this is before Scorsese used Thelma Schoonmaker as an editor, his long-time contributor and editor since. And yet the editing, I think, is fantastic. Cinematography is fantastic. Obviously, the music is, particularly if you're a fan of like late 60s, early 70s rock, is fantastic too. But also he uses a lot of, I think, Neapolitan music as well, opera. And like I say, a lot of these things probably have become commonplace in cinema since, but I still don't think they've been utilised as effectively to build the world and the characters that Scorsese creates for what is essentially a kind of, like I say, a great hangout movie, I think. And one of the great movies of the 70s. I really think it's one of the great kind of, I wouldn't say independent movies of the 70s, but of course it's backed by Warner. But I think it's because it has all the qualities of a great independent movie. And yeah, I just wanted to come on here and talk about why I still think it's a great movie, the things that make it a great film, and why, for those of you that haven't seen it, should, and for those of you who have, don't forget about it, because it is a great film. And get hold of this set if you can, or if you want to. It's a very, very good set. I intend to read the rest of the book. But yeah, that's why I think it's a great movie. I don't know what you guys think about Mean Streets. Let me know if you think it's one of Scorsese's best, what you love about the film, maybe what you dislike about the film. Like I say, I think a lot of modern audiences don't have the patience for the kind of the lack of plot and narrative, the free flow improvisational style. I think you have to be accustomed to the cinema that came before that as well in order to properly appreciate and enjoy and experience Mean Streets. For example, there's a lot of scenes that seem to go nowhere in terms of narrative. The scene between Charlie and Johnny Boy in the back of the bar, where Johnny Boy's spinning this yarn just to get Charlie off his back, essentially lying to his friend just to get out of paying debts then and there to Michael, is a fantastic scene that was clearly built on improvisation, because you see De Niro confusing Cattell by name dropping so many people that Cattell actually thinks that he's referring to the same person. It's clearly then and there. It's great acting. It's a great scene, and that's improvisation done right, I think, and it's a fantastic scene. And one that I think Scorsese was originally going to drop, but then he actually showed it to Cassavetes, and Cassavetes says, "Do not drop that scene. You keep that scene." Actually, because it says everything about the dynamic between the relationship between those two characters there, how they both enable, but also mistrust and essentially lie to each other in many ways. And Mean Streets in a lot of ways is about the kind of the dangers of being a diplomat. I think that Charlie does his best to try and really please everyone, and essentially he's his fault is he's too nice of a guy. Actually, he's too nice for the mafia. He's too nice for the world that he lives in, Nonetheless, he's made choices because of the world that's presented to him. And that's why he wrestles with them, because his conscience tells him that he shouldn't be doing those things. Like I said, it's a film essentially about Catholic guilt that Scorsese himself has wrestled, or still does, I suppose, to a degree, wrestle with, in the sense that it's central to him. There's that great quote by Scorsese, isn't it? Religion and movies essentially are his life. Two things: religion and movies. And I think Mean Streets is both a love letter to the movies, but also, of course, to Roman Catholicism. So yeah, those are my thoughts on the film. By all means, share what you think of Mean Streets. Do you think it's a vital key film of the 70s? I certainly do. Yeah, and that's what I wanted to come on and talk about. So as always, thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next one. Take care.